Hey guys, Jake Steele, Iron and Steel. This is podcast episode number 4. Thank you for being here. This story is called Erwin's Revenge. It's available on my website, ironandsteel.com. Essentially, this is kind of your gasser, barn find, survivor, wet dream scenario. Long story short, pair of cars campaigned here in the Pacific Northwest. Extremely dominant cars. Won a lot of races and stuffed away after the gasser craze kind of died down in the late 60s. And these cars were just kind of forgotten for decades and decades and decades. Ultimately, a friend of mine, Robbie Davis, was able to purchase both cars, put them back together as a pair, put them back on the track, and preserve some of the history too. Jackets, trophies, all that stuff. All the time capsule stuff that you would hope for. That's what this whole story is about. So I would really encourage you to go to ironandsteel.com, look up this story, Erwin's Revenge, if nothing else, just to see the photos. There's tons of photos associated with this story from back in the day, like originally in the 60s, and photos of them being rediscovered and being pulled out of the garage, and then current day photos of these cars back on the track, and it's pretty impressive. So again, ironandsteel.com, Erwin's Revenge. Go there, check out the photos. But for now, thanks again for being here, and sit back, relax. I'll tell you the story. Look, we're just sort of making this shit up now. Emulating, pretending, copying, imitating. We flip through magazines, listen to the same stories, and watch the same few tired documentaries over and over. We scavenge for parts, a piece here, another there, swap meets, online bidding sites. We jack up the front ends and get excited. We paint it to look the part, give it a clever name. Maybe we put a number on it. We tell our buddies what we're doing. I'm building a gasser. It's a cliche. It's a fucking tagline. Look, some of these cars do hit the strip, but let's face it, a lot don't. Most don't. It's all well and good, but there was a time in history when these cars that we're copying now weren't built to be driven to some stupid local cruise-in on a Wednesday night. They were built to go fast and to win at any cost. These cars were primitive, often downright unsafe. They were flat-towed to the track behind some shitty station wagon and raced hard, then hitched up and hauled home to fix whatever broke before the next weekend. The guys that piloted these fire-snorting, rudimentary, rolling war zones were the real fucking deal. This stuff was no joke. They weren't pretending. They were making history. All we have left now are photos, and for a few lucky ones, some fleeting first-hand memories. Even more rare is to find examples of these old racers as they truly were. And this is what we're talking about here. These cars are it. And this story is what it was to be a hard racing weekend warrior in the gas class craze of the 1960s. Most importantly, it's about what these guys truly craved. Winning. Erwin von Hallmeyer of Portland, Oregon was about as good of an example of the type of brass-balled racers trolling the drag strips of the day as you can get. He was just a regular guy. He worked for his family's dry cleaning business, Hallmeyer's Cleaners, which was in a rough part of town on the north end of Portland. Outside of work, though, just one thing mattered to him: drag racing. Like most young men of the time, it began on the street. Taunts of "drag it out" directed at some local yokel in a parking lot, leading to a gear-jamming ride down some country road, or even the main drag, Union Avenue. Around this time, sanctioned drag racing on designated strips had become the norm, and Erwin found himself, like a lot of young men of the time, looking for a full-blown race car. It began with the acquisition of a 1939 Willys Coupe, which Erwin dragged out of a farmer's field in late 1961. He started by gathering parts and making his plans. By 1962, hot rod and drag racing publications started to buzz about California's Bing's Speed Shop and the dominance that they had displayed in a 1941 Willys Coupe, which sported a full race flathead Ford. Erwin had taken note of this, and a fan himself of winning races, he placed a call to Ed Bengelli to see what could be done about building an engine to the exact same specifications. Ed and his shop, however, were just too busy to take anything else on at that time. It seemed all that publicity had set fire to their phone lines, and they were booked for the foreseeable future. Instead, Ed offered to sell Erwin the actual engine that had been doing all that winning. A deal was made, and the pumped-up flathead was plucked from Ed's Willys and stuck on a pallet to be shipped by rail to Portland, Oregon, to a waiting Erwin von Hallmeyer. Erwin wasted no time stuffing that Bing's engine between the frame rails of his Willys, with predictable results. Right off the bat, he began winning, and he continued to win, and win, and win. Up and down the coast of the Pacific Northwest, the Blue Hallmeyer's Willys became virtually unbeatable. In fact, Erwin was so dominant that at his home track, Woodburn Drag Strip, as time went on, the admiration of fellow racers and in some cases spectators alike who were initially in awe of his winning streaks began to turn into something else. People began to get a bit jaded. After a couple of years, it was not uncommon for the Willys to be booed on the return road after yet again sending the competition packing as predicted. His cousins, Hans and Carl, were often with him, helping with the Willys and racing their own cars in other classes. After a while, it began to seem like it was the von Hallmeyers versus everyone else. The boys fed into this, and it was not uncommon for them to make a scene, behave oddly, or even in some cases get into fights on any given weekend. As a sidebar, I actually ran into a guy about 7 or 8 years ago who, it turned out, ran the lights for several years at Woodburn Drag Strip, the von Hallmeyers' local haunt. I asked him if he remembered them, and he instantly recoiled and got a startled look on his face. "Oh, God," he said. "Yeah, I remember the von Hallmeyers. They won a lot, but they were always getting into some sort of shit." I asked him to elaborate, and he just kind of smirked, and as he shook his head, he said, "Look, I don't know how to put it other than they were the guys that when they were there, everyone knew it. They were always just in the middle of something, and they ruffled a lot of feathers." One particular example of feather ruffling was done with a brush and a can of one-shot. In response to the booing at the starting line and on the return road, on both sides of his car, just behind the doors, Erwin painted large hands prominently flipping the bird. The message was clear. "You don't like me? Well, fuck you." It was a bold statement, but it was one that summed up the von Hallmeyers and their personas pretty well. It was also short-lived, as track officials gave Erwin an ultimatum: scrub it off or don't come back. Ultimately, he decided to continue to let his racing do the bird flipping instead. He removed the fingers and returned the next weekend with what I can only describe as the nagging woman painted in their place, which they're still on the car to this day, and I would recommend going to the site to see the photos, but it's pretty cool. I'm trying to find photos of the short span of when it had the flipping the bird on both sides, but so far I haven't found anything like that. In a quest for more speed, Erwin eventually purchased a 48 Anglia and painted it the same shade of blue. He then transferred the Bing's flathead from the Willys into it. The theory was smaller car with the same drivetrain equals faster times. But ultimately, there were no vast improvements in ET or miles per hour, and the Anglia proved to be a much harder car to drive than the Willys, which by this time was relegated to the corner to wait for a small block Chevy that never came. At this point, it was the late 1960s. Drag racing rules were changing, becoming more restrictive and more strict. The final straw for Erwin was when the NHRA began to require drivers to be licensed. In order to get said license, you would have to have a physical performed. Erwin was convinced that this was simply a ploy to allow the government to freely size men up for the draft. After all, drag racing was an enormously popular sport, with thousands of men racing on any given weekend. By this time, his cousins were beginning to get out of the hobby as well, and for Erwin, this license requirement spelled the end of his drag racing career. The Anglia was parked in the corner of the garage at Hallmeyer's Cleaners, beside the Willys, and both were all but forgotten for more than 30 years. By the 1990s, Hallmeyer's Cleaners had long since been closed. The building sat vacant for decades. Vacant, that is, except for a few cars stashed away in the back. Now, most were delivery vehicles for the cleaners, but among them sat two very specific cars. They were both just the way they had been left, with the Willys missing its drivetrain and the Anglia still sitting on the trailer that it had come back from its last race on. Neither one had moved an inch, and both had begun to deteriorate. Now, the property had changed hands, and the old racers were yanked out and sold off. Unfortunately, the two did not stay together, and it would be another 20 years before they would be reunited. Robbie Davis is the kind of guy that's always on the hunt. He's always on the move, always in the middle of some type of deal, and above all, always buying and or building ridiculously cool cars. It was on one of these hunts that he would make a find that would prove to be life-changing. Now, this wasn't even one of his deals that day. He was just helping a friend go pick up a Chevy Nomad. Now, coincidentally, that car ended up being the Mad Wagon, which is Russ Meek's car that Russ built decades ago. It was an old show car. And it gets some pretty significant mentions and coverage in a story that I wrote about Russ and his life for Hop Up magazine. And if you want to read that, it is very interesting. Russ Meeks is an incredibly interesting, talented guy. And if you do want to take the time to look that up, that's Hop Up magazine. It was volume 14, number 3. So Hop Up 14.3, Russ Meeks, if you want to look that up. It'll be worth your time. So anyway, as his friend looked the Nomad over, Robbie's eyes were drawn to an old Willys Coupe sitting just beyond it. When asked, the story was pretty vague, and the whole point was the car wasn't for sale. So they loaded up the Nomad and headed home. But there was no way Robbie was about to let that go. And after a persistent few months, the Willys did come home to the Temple of Speed, which is Robbie's enormous shop at his house in Fairview, Oregon. It's just a hobby shop. It's not open to the public, but the number of insanely cool and oftentimes historic cars that have rumbled out of the bay doors there would leave you weak in the knees. Now, we've all heard the story, or something close, and it goes something like this. Two brothers built this car in the 60s to go drag racing. One brother was drafted, died in Vietnam. The other brother, so grief-stricken, pushes the car into the garage, covers it with a tarp, never touches it again. Right. About 10% of the time, the truth resembles that story in some way, but usually it's just the go-to for some bozo romanticizing the car he's trying to sell you. Or maybe that's what he was told and he actually believes it. Who knows? And really, who knows where these stories come from? Now, the tale attached to Robbie's Willys wasn't exactly that verbatim, but it did mimic it. The gist of it was basically the same, and the end result was that the guy, Erwin, was long gone. Not having any reason to doubt that, and with no particular sense of urgency, Robbie stashed the Willys in his shop and made tentative plans to totally rebuild it from the ground up. These plans included things like swapping the front end for a 40 nose, painting it a different color, etc. After all, he had no particular kinship with the car's history or the mysterious Erwin, who was apparently long dead. It was just an old race car, and after all, it needed everything anyway. He stuffed it away and went back to work on the cars that were ahead of it in line. Before long, though, his curiosity got the better of him. As time passed and the Willys waited its turn, Robbie went looking for information. He wanted to know about Hallmeyer's Cleaners, who Erwin was, and the story behind his car. He found that the building itself was gone, but after many dead ends, he eventually found the man who had purchased it from the Hallmeyer family. What he told Robbie changed everything. He said, "I don't know who told you that about Erwin, about him being dead, but he's very much alive, and in fact, I can put you in touch with him." Robbie wasted no time. Before long, he met with Erwin, who was in failing health. A strong friendship quickly blossomed out of the encounter, one that led to Robbie essentially turning into Erwin's self-appointed caretaker for the remainder of his life. Along the way, Erwin began feeding Robbie the story of the car's history. He also slowly gave him things associated with it: trophies, drag strip jackets, time slips, photos. And he told him where he could find more, at his cousin Carl's house. Now this would turn out to be a long saga that continues to this day, and Carl still has a bunch of trophies and things, but he's not interested in letting them go, let's just say that. And oh yes, there was one more thing Erwin told him right off the bat. He said there was a sister car, an Anglia. This, of course, changed things drastically. Now, rather than just some old race car, the Willys took on a new identity. No more mystery, no more speculation. It was Erwin von Hallmeyer's car. With the story and with meeting the man, it meant something to Robbie. "I couldn't just erase that," Robbie says. "Once it's gone, it's gone." So, not wanting to be the guy responsible for erasing history and wiping away a significant part of his now good friend's life, Robbie's plans changed. Now the name of the game was preservation. What couldn't be saved was rebuilt just as it was, and although the car had ran a flathead originally, Erwin had always planned to replace it with a small block Chevy, so Robbie decided he would compromise on exact replication in this area, in favor of being the one that did what Erwin had ultimately planned to do. He installed a healthy 383 and a 4-speed, and most importantly, in the back of his mind, he started secretly making plans to locate and purchase the matching Anglia. After a few tedious years, the Willys was almost done, and Robbie worked feverishly to complete it in time to show to Erwin. By this time, he had arranged to have Erwin put into a nursing home, where he went several times a week to check on and care for his friend. Meanwhile, the Willys turned out to be no easy build. Wanting to preserve the car, while at the same time making it safe and rebuilding what had deteriorated over the years, proved to be a difficult juggling act. In the end, the car was completely rebuilt from the bare frame up, engineered by Robbie to drive well and to get to the other end of the track quickly and safely. The body itself was able to be cleaned up and saved, and it still wears the $20 Earlshire paint job that Erwin put on it in the early 1960s, along with the nagging woman painted on the sides. The paint on the nose was too far gone to clean up, but was perfectly replicated by Robbie's cousin Lester. Sadly, just days before the coupe would drive under its own power for the very first time in almost 45 years, Robbie received a call that his friend Erwin had passed away. The news was especially devastating given the fact that he had wanted so badly to take the finished car to Erwin, to show him that his story would not be lost to time, and to give him one last white-knuckled ride in his beloved old race car. It was a tough blow, and it made the quest to find the Anglia and to reunite the two cars, as well as much of the memorabilia as possible, that much more intense. To Robbie, it was important, and he would not be stopped. Information on the Anglia proved to be sparse. It turned out to be just as difficult as the original journey with the Willys and with Erwin. Eventually, through some serious investigative work, the car was located in southern Oregon. The good news was, it did still have the Bing Speed Shop built flathead in place, which the current owner had had correctly and carefully freshened up. The bad news, it had since been painted metallic blue, the Hallmeyer's Cleaners history was painted over, and worse, the car wasn't for sale. And the guy didn't exactly seem the type that might be hurting for money anytime soon. A different approach had to be taken. One that might appeal to the guy's better nature. Robbie had to sell him the story. The plan to put all the scattered puzzle pieces back together, and it took a long time and a lot of conversations and a very aggressive offer, but eventually Robbie was able to load the Anglia up and reunite it with its long-lost racing buddy, the now completed Willys Coupe. The Anglia really was pretty perfectly preserved other than the fresh paint. The Bing's Flatty ran out well and it drove, albeit a little on the scary side, just fine. Robbie tasked Aaron Clyde of Southbound Customs to respray the car in its as-raced blue and then had the lettering perfectly replicated from photos by local pinstriper Spider-Man. He then corrected a few things with the Anglia's steering geometry to improve its manners as much as possible and hit the strip. There are a few photos of the cars lined up side by side at Eagle Field that would whet the eye of just about any hot rodder or old racer that might have taken the time to learn this story. On top of that, if I remember correctly, Robbie was in the Anglia and our dear late friend Shorty was piloting the Willys on that day. At any rate, it was truly a sight to see and one that I'm sure Erwin was watching and smiling about. Well, as of now, Robbie's been able to reunite both cars, around 100 trophies, many of which have the date and the ET handwritten on the bottom, 2 championship jackets, a dozen or so old photos, countless time slips, pit passes, and a few other sporadic pieces of the puzzle. He even has the old custom-built trailer that the Anglia rode to the drag strip on. One thing, though, was made clear by Erwin shortly before he died. He said, "All of those trophies that Robbie has, which, when viewed together in a group, is pretty impressive and staggering, are not even a small drop in the bucket." Erwin said, "There's no telling how many were lost, thrown away, or misplaced." His cousin Carl is still alive, and it is known that he still has plenty, along with many other things related to those hard racing days. He's not, however, particularly concerned about giving them up, despite many attempts to recover whatever may be there. For now, that's where they rest, leaving us to daydream and wonder about what may be there, but powerless to do anything about it. As it turns out, it seems the von Hommeyers still want to win. There you have it, Erwin's Revenge. I guess in hindsight, I should rename it Carl's Revenge, since that fucker's still holding those trophies over our heads. I won't give them up, but who knows? We'll see what happens in time, but I'm hoping that Robbie's able to get those trophies as well, but we'll see. So anyway, Erwin's Revenge, ironandsteel.com is the website. Again, I would encourage you to go there, look at this story so you can see the photos associated with it. There's a bunch of killer photos on there throughout the years that tell the story of these cars, and it's definitely worth checking out. ironandsteel.com, all the content's free. There's a couple t-shirts on there if you feel like supporting Iron and Steel. If not, I don't give a shit. Do whatever you want. Everything there is free. 30 or so stories on there currently. I'm adding more every couple of weeks or so. And if you don't want to go there and read them, I'm just going to continue to pluck them off of there and convert them into audio and release them as podcasts. So again, ironandsteel.com. Thanks so much for being here. I appreciate it. And we'll see you on the next one.